Mr. Speaker, I rise today cognizant of the expectation on our shoulders from those who sent us to this honorable house to represent their interests and ensure that as Guyanese, that they all can benefit from the nation coffers based on need and the creation of opportunities, utilizing the principles of equity and equality. We may be on opposite sides of the House, Mr. Speaker, because of who elected us as their representatives, but I can assure you that the ordinary Guyanese, represented on both sides of the House, desire to be an equal part of society and benefit likewise. This is not only a task, but a responsibility which we must deliver without fear, favor, or ill will. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to do this in earnest and due diligence, because a country this wealthy has no excuse not to deliver in equal measures to all the people. The budget is serious business. It ensconces the financial management of the country for 2023 and what measures or lack thereof government has provided as a pathway or a hindrance, particularly for the ordinary Guyanese man who rely on us to create opportunities for them to thrive. We are reminded by Derek Hamilton, Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, that there are other ways, and I quote, to define economic value and traditional measures have not captured what is first and foremost our most treasured asset in the world, which is people. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, critical examination, assessment, and dissection of this budget in relation to the rights, needs, and welfare of all Guyanese are imperative before arriving at a decision whether this budget is national or partisan. Mr. Speaker, some 43 years ago, the nation transitioned from a constitution given to us by our former colonial master to a constitution which was indigenous and reflective of the aspirations, hopes, and ideals of all the Guyanese people. Indeed, we would recall that no one other than Dr. Cheddi Jagan himself declared that he found nothing really wrong with the 1980 Constitution. Articles 24, 26, and 27, for example, confer the right of free medical attention and social care in the case of old age and infirmity, free education from nursery to university, and the right to proper housing accommodation. Mr. Speaker, the constitutional commitment to social and economic rights, as stated in the aforementioned articles of the Constitution, were never intended to be barren, sterile, or arid legal provisions. They were meant to be state obligations which underpin the nation of Guyana. In 2016, Mr. Speaker, the Partnership for National Unity signed the oil production sharing agreement to ensure and guarantee a prosperous and stable economic future for all the Guyanese people. Despite the PPP much maligning the oil production agreement, it is the basis of the economic growth that the PPP now seeks to falsely claim as its own and is now grossly mismanaging. What is really owned by the PPPC, Mr. Speaker, is a grave deterioration in the quality of life of most Guyanese, increased poverty, increased hunger, low wages, high crime, ever-increasing unemployment, especially among the youth, low pension, malnutrition, and little or no meaningful attention to the elderly, aged, and infirm. However, Mr. Speaker, the PPP budgets certainly have one thing in common. That is the failure to introduce a vision and a plan for all Guyanese, consistent with our motto of one people, one nation, one destiny. Mr. Speaker, they expose the ugly underbelly of structural discrimination, evident in the growing income gap between the haves and the have-nots, the few beneficiaries of the PPPC's One Guyana and the vast majority of Guyanese. The economic decay is reflective of the decay in the quality of citizens' legal rights and their opportunities to access for their own economic empowerment. It remains today, Mr. Speaker, relevant as stated by Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham in his speech, A Vision of the Cooperative Republic, that this nation must be cognizant, and I quote, of social needs and wants in creating a just society for the people of Guyana, end of quote. He stated also, Mr. Speaker, that a just society cannot be achieved unless the majority of people, the masses, the little men, have a full share in the ownership and control of the economy. Mr. Speaker, apart from the PPPC's One Guyana, the majority of the people, the masses, the little men and women have not benefited from the oil economy, nor have they seen their quality of life positively impacted. Since 2020, the economy has grown. It has grown, Mr. Speaker, 43.5%, 20.1%, 62.3%, and projected to grow in 2023 some 25.2%. But it's amazing, Mr. Speaker, that the Honorable Minister has been unable to point to any ownership by the little men and women and their families in the ownership and control of the economy. We call upon this government, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the government provide mechanisms for ordinary Guyanese to own and control the economy. The stable inflation rates from 2016 to 2020, despite high levels of economic growth under our side of this Honorable House, saw greater spending power of the Guyanese people, greater rates of saving, and lowering of poverty. To this, the nation owes and holds gratitude to the prudential stewardship of the former Minister of Finance, Winston Jordan, President David Granger, Prime Minister Nagamutu, and the ministers of that government. Mr. Speaker, inflation has rapidly increased under the PPPC from 2020 to 21 when compared with the APNU's period of governance. In 2016 to 2020, inflation was 1.4%, 1.5%, 1.6%, 2.1%, and 0.9% respectively. During the PPPC's period, Mr. Speaker, it's recorded as 5.79 and 9.4 in 2021 and 2022 respectively, and is expected to be 3.8% in 2023. Mr. Speaker, the high inflation and high prices are wreaking havoc in this country, and this government must bear full and accept full responsibility for this. The PPP budget offers no prospects for equitable economic and social transformation, which is now more necessary than ever for the people to prosper in an economy identified as the world's fastest growing. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister, in his budget presentation, omitted to provide us with any information on the human development of the Guyanese people. I submit that the deteriorating quality of life of most Guyanese since 2020, the minister thought it prudent in this oil-rich economy to hide the facts. But facts are stubborn and cannot be hidden. Mr. Speaker, you would have heard how perturbed they are when we mention the Food and Agricultural Organization report. They want to say that it's a report done during the period of the APNU AFC. But Mr. Speaker, what cannot be denied is that for the last 31 years of government in this country, these fellows over there have been in government for 26 years. The problem is their failure to effectively...
You know better. These fellows over there.
Sorry, Your Honor. These honorable fellows, Your Honor. These honorable members have been unable to effectively deal with the issues, Your Honor. That is why, Mr. Speaker, the report says that around 43% of the Guyanese 43% of Guyana's population cannot afford a healthy diet. Mr. Speaker, they may not like it, but this is the fruits of their governance for 26 of the last 31 years. Mr. Speaker, this certainly isn't the quality of life any caring government would desire for people or flippantly speak about. Guyana, the PPP is spending billions on infrastructure and has forgotten our struggling working class, single parents, youth, ordinary families, farmers, fisher folk, the elderly, our brothers and sisters in the indigenous communities. Our people are suffering under the heavy, rising cost of living caused by this government with their poor fiscal policies, tearing into every pot and pan of every Guyanese home across the country. This government has become disconnected from suffering families, and this can be seen in the more than 100-fold increase in prices for the period January to December 2022. Ordinary items, Mr. Speaker. Cabbage has increased by 130%, pumpkin by 185%, edos by 150%, eggs by 82%, borers by 183%, pak choy by 166%. This is what the Guyanese people are facing. The facts, Mr. Speaker, the prices of basic commodities have increased at a pace that now outstrips income of any sort, whether salary, whether wages, whether pensions. Social and economic inequalities are increasing for the vast majority of Guyanese, yet the budget has failed to address these. This must be a source of shame on the president, it must be a source of shame on the finance ministry, and certainly a source of shame on the government. What the honorable minister has failed to address also in the budget is Guyana's score on the Human Capital Index, which reveals some frightening matters, Mr. Speaker. It discloses that 97% of our children survive to age 5. Increasing levels of non-communicable disease contribute to only 79% of our 18-year-olds potentially surviving to age 60, with only 3/4 of our 15-year-old boys reaching 60. You would agree, Mr. Speaker, these are disturbing statistics. The health and longevity of our people are critical for the nation's development. Likewise, the survival of both sexes to ensure procreation, family stability, and growth. 12% of our children under 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition, twice the rate in the interior of Guyana. The maternal mortality rate is now 229 per 100,000 live births, one of the highest rates in the region. The healthcare professional to population ratio is 31 physicians and nurses to 10,000 of our population. Suicide rates continue to be high, with Guyana still having one of the highest rates in the Caribbean, 30.2 suicides per 100,000 persons. We on this side of the House believe that the government must increase in real time and real terms allocations to education and health, and these must be directed to the quality delivery of necessary resources, training, and recruiting competent personnel. Mr. Speaker, the recent announcement by the government that it is against the cash transfer because it cannot afford it has no basis in evidence other than the partisan desire to keep the poor, vulnerable persons from benefiting from our oil wealth, therefore increasing the poverty gap. Cash transfers must not only be paid to the poor and vulnerable based on needs, but to every household as recommended by Guyana's and the regional's premier labor economist, Professor Clive Thomas. The PPP, despite rapidly worsening the economic circumstances in Guyana since 2020, decrease in poverty and the abundance of oil resources, have failed to expand and overhaul the social safety net. The government must at once provide unemployment grants, establish a social safety net that addresses the circumstances of young children, young persons, elders, and women in our society. Mr. Speaker, among the travesties still occurring in Guyana is the persistent failure by the government to make wages and salaries livable and to respect the constitutional right to collective bargaining for all unionized workers in the public service, or where the government is a shareholder. I believe this government must act now and move to the bargaining table with the trade unions to achieve increased wages and salaries and improve conditions of work reflective of an oil and gas economy. The government has failed to deliver on its elections campaign's promise of a 50% increase to all public servants after more than 2 years in government. Unilaterally tossing less than 20% increase in wages and salaries to public servants in 3 years is as discriminatory as it can get. In 2020, public servants received nothing. In 2021, they were tossed a 7% taxable increase, and in 2022, an 8% taxable increase. This is unacceptable. What is needed for the small man in this country, Mr. Speaker, is a helping hand up, not the government's boot on his neck. Mr. Speaker, when the government boasts of development to the people, this development is meaningless if it is not accessible to our people. In instances where the government is seeking to establish housing development, citizens are being asked to pay exorbitant sums of money on unlivable wages and salaries. The locations of these areas are far removed from persons' workplaces and their children's schools. Persons also can't get to locations where these houses are going up neither because they cannot afford to purchase a car. It is a situation of one step forward and many steps backward. The situation will get worse if we do not value the importance of progressive infrastructural development and building communities which are accompanied by the requisite amenities and services. And even though we are seeking to break free of poverty by the seemingly supportive opportunities that exist, they remain shackled by policies that do not empower them either. Mr. Speaker, I believe that we can afford to build quality houses for the ordinary Guyanese man and woman. The construction of these must come from small contractors, primarily the marginalized communities of our society. This is a plan that will give the small man an opportunity to escape poverty. The government is also facilitating the massive transfer of state wealth and awarding huge contracts to the identified One Guyana. Flagrant disregard for the public sector workers and the vulnerable in our midst continues despite evidence of the vast economic disparities and the repeated advice to pursue political inclusion and shared prosperity. Even the Joe Biden administration had urged this government to act responsibly. In the world's fastest growing economy, the government ignores that 49% of the people are living in poverty. 48% of the population is existing on less than $1,200 Guyana dollars a day. And it is in this Guyana that pensioners are expected to survive on $33,000 per month with today's cost of living. These groups, which represent the majority of Guyana, get no direct benefit from living in the fastest or the fifth fastest growing, depending on what the president says, economy. Only the One Guyana, that special One Guyana, is benefiting from this growth. Mr. Speaker, this budget is anti-family. It has given the small man nothing, nothing to survive on, nothing to live on, nothing to hope for. As families are stretching themselves thin on small incomes, the government has been withdrawing billions from the Natural Resource Fund. But these sums have had no direct impact on the ordinary lives of the people. 3 times last year, the government dipped into the fund. In May, for $200 million was withdrawn. In July, another $200 million, and this month, $207.6 million. In 2022, Guyana earned more than $1 billion in oil and gas revenue, more than $150 million in royalty, and the economy grew by more than 60%. By no stretch of the imagination, Mr. Speaker, is Guyana a poor country, but yet poverty is pervasive with a widening economic disparity and government indifference. My fellow Guyanese, we would like the government to address its mind, assuming it has a mind and a heart, to the philosophical underpinning of Aristotle's theory, and I quote, "Poverty is the parent of revolution and crime." Aristotle is referenced, Mr. Speaker, merely to direct attention to the causative effects of deprivation and what we must do as representatives of our people to address this. The reappearance of street executioners and extrajudicial killings are symptomatic of the social decay and the return of the breakdown in law and order. Mr. Speaker, these indicators do not augur well for the stability of our people and our beloved country, Guyana. 2 days before the budget presentation, Guyanese were shocked at the news of the gunning down of Delon Josiah at his home, in his bedroom, at Perseverance on the east bank of Demerara. Days earlier, Anthony Charles, called Skiddy, of Leopold Street, was gunned down in broad daylight. This assembly cannot ignore these untoward happenings in our streets, either by rogue officers and or by civilians, threatening the safety and security of us all. It is not the national development, Mr. Speaker, when the PPP continues to ensure that significant and transformative projects are only landed in their geopolitical strongholds, a continuation of what continued and obtained during the previous terms in office. Guyanese are aware that the hospitality training complex is identified for Port Moran, the gas to shore at Wales, the packaging plant in Edmore, and the list goes on and on. There have been no similar economic transformational projects, as far as we know, slated anywhere near communities represented and dominated by supporters of the opposition. This is the president's One Guyana, and this should certainly offend our sense of national consciousness. The largest budget in the history of the nation deliberately avoids meaningful funding to the predominantly black civil service and discipline services. I can say more, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the attention is now going to be directed to the travesty in Caneview, Mocha, in which the police was used by the executive of this country to prevent their fellow Guyanese from protecting their homestead and belongings. It's beside the point, Mr. Speaker, whether they were asked to remove or offered support to move. Mr. Speaker, will the other side of this assembly initiate this very public policy to clear the Grove to Diamond East Bank reserves, which will ease traffic congestion in the East Bank corridor? This legislature, this lawmaking branch of this government, in which sits the executives, members, knows that homeowners, be they described as squatters or otherwise, have rights. No government should demolish persons' homes and properties without engagement, providing them with comparative opportunities for relocation and securing their hard-earned possessions and investments. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities report illuminated the 12 misconceptions and misunderstandings of the right to housing. The report dispelled the notion of squatters being criminals and unworthy of meaningful engagement and respect. Indeed, our Constitution, Article 154 of the Constitution, demands and calls upon every state organization to respect the rights arising under international treaties. Lest it be forgotten, we were elected here to represent our people, and this representation must be to the benefit of all the Guyanese people. The PPP continues in this regard to fall woefully short. The government's inattentiveness to the people is also reflected in its treatment of the judiciary. Not only has President Irfan Ali failed to respond to the Honorable Leader of the Opposition's, Mr. Aubrey Norton's letter agreeing to the substantive appointments of Mrs. Janet Cummings Edwards and Mrs. Roxanne George Wiltshire Senior Counsel as Chancellor and Chief Justice respectfully, consistent with Article 127 of our Constitution, he has failed to ensure that the judiciary has been conferred with the required human resources to dispense justice in a timely manner. Initiation by the President of the required consultation with the Leader of the Opposition for the appointment of confirmed officers must happen forthwith. Mr. Speaker, the judiciary demands immediate attention, and I believe the dilly-dallying must end. The situation is dire, and the government's dereliction of duty was politely addressed by the acting Chancellor, Justice Cummings Edwards, when she said, and I quote, "We need more judges. We need the Judicial Service Commission to be established ASAP as soon as possible. We are facing increased caseloads. Judges are now overburdened. They are exhausted. They are nearly worn out, and they are in some cases burned out," end of quote. Undoubtedly, Justice Cummings felt compelled to remind the executive, and I quote again, "We do not need a rhetoric. We need more laborers. We need the judges. We've been hearing time and time again about the JSC soon to be established. We would like to see the implementation and the establishment of the Judicial Service Commission." Mr. Speaker, as an officer of the court and a member of this House, and my fellow colleague, Honorable Member Anil Nandalal, Senior Counsel, he ought to be advised, and I do advise him, to render proper advice to the President, to ensure that the executive honors its obligations to the judicature. All are aware that justice delayed is denied, and the morale of the members of the judiciary is tied to the employment stability and the proper conditions under which they dispense justice. Mr. Speaker, a review of the budget disclosed that all the essential characteristics of the Dutch disease, it certainly discloses it, Mr. Speaker. None other than Mr. Geoffrey De Silva, a PPPC comrade, has waved the red flag in our faces. He identifies the manifestation of the Dutch disease in 4 spheres. These are the political, financial, economic, and social. The characteristics are there's political instability and increase into ethnic rivalry. National institutions are weak, ineffectual, and corrupt. The people have less say in government. The government is over-dependent on oil income for its revenues. There's unrestrained public spending. Crude oil are a very large part of the exports. There's little economic diversification, and the competitiveness of the non-oil sectors, including agriculture and manufacturing, is declining. All types of crime are increasing. Professionals are paid low salaries compared to foreign professionals. The education system produces the wrong graduates, and it is tailored to bureaucracy instead of productive sectors. There's a brain drain, and there's no limit on the foreign number of employees in the country. Political office holders are paid highly, while workers and farmers earn relatively low income. These are the views of their own Geoffrey De Silva. That is exactly the situation in Guyana, Mr. Speaker. The pages in this budget reveal that government's overdependence on oil income, and there's no restraint in public spending. Mr. Speaker, we heard from the Minister of Finance that the major non-oil sectors of the economy are indeed declining. Mr. Speaker, we heard and the country heard from the Honorable Minister that crime is increasing. Guyana is now ranked at level 3 by the USA Travel Advisory, which is a message to avoid traveling to Guyana due to the increase of crime. A recent survey indicated Guyanese prefer to migrate than rather to stay here in Guyana. It is my view, Mr. Speaker, we can prevent the ravages of the Dutch disease, but the socio-economic process must change from exclusion to inclusion. This could be sensibly done through Article 13 of the Constitution, which provides the basis for inclusive governance, shared prosperity, peace, and social cohesion. Before I take my leave, Mr. Speaker, it's timely, I believe, to remind this House that Premier Forbes Burnham in 1964 said, all the people of this country are important, whether they belong to a large group or a small group. The Amerindians are important, the Chinese are important, the Portuguese are important, the Europeans are important, the mixed races are important, the Africans are important, the Indians are important. In short, all Guyanese are important and valued members of our community. We cherish them and consider them, and it is the duty and privilege of government to guard and protect and further the real interests of all. These words, Mr. Speaker, articulate the desire of every Guyanese, and they were more evident on the 26th of May when the then Minority Leader Dr. Chetty Jagan and Prime Minister Forbes Burnham embraced us as a Guyana, embraced a new nation to lay the indigenous foundation of inclusivity, equality, and equity. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, following members of this House, Honorable House, it's being proposed that we do the honorable thing and scrap this budget. Together, along with the national stakeholders, let us conceptualize a vision for all Guyana and put a spending plan in place to reflect all Guyana, not one Guyana, and return to this honorable House to unanimously approve a national budget that secures the rights and interests and prosperity of all Guyana. I'm sure my colleagues on this side of the House and those on the government side who believe that all Guyanese are important will not oppose a national vision, a national economic plan that is inclusive, which would give hope to all Guyana and the aspirational flame of our founding fathers and mothers for one people, one nation, one destiny. It remains as bright today as it was the dawn of independence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.